Maayong udto sa inyong tanan. Good noon, everybody. Today, we're going to talk about sampling. How do we design our sample? How do we collect our samples? Sampling is a very important concept when we do survey research, and many of the thesis proposals use the survey method as a means of getting data. So now, let's discuss sampling. Sampling is a very important concept because with sampling, you are able to show that your research methodologies are scientific and reliable. Sampling will also save a lot of money because you don't need to interview everybody who is part of the population of interest. With sampling, you will be able to understand your population without asking everybody about the topics that you are concerned in your research. So, first of all, the first type of sampling is the random sampling. When you do random sampling, it implies that a list is available, and with that list, all members of the population have the equal chance of being selected. So, when everybody has an equal chance of being selected, then you are able to reduce the bias in your selection of participants in your research. Next is sampling could also be done through stratified techniques. And stratification implies that there's a class or categories and that there are members in the class. So for instance, if your study is about the graduate school students' attitudes towards completing their degrees, you have to do a stratification by classifying your respondents into different programs. So you will have respondents from the business management, educational management, public administration, uh, Philippine studies, the PhD program, and the sustainable development program, so that every class is represented in your sampling methodology. So there's a class, and the class would require that there are members of the class, and the members of the class should be able to pass through the inclusion criteria that you will define in your definition of terms. Next in sampling is the systematic sampling. So when you do systematic sampling, there is what we call a pattern of selection. You have a pattern. So you set the pattern. For instance, you would interview every fifth, every 10th, every 15th in the list, providing that provided that you have a list in your in population of interest. So that would be systematic sampling. And of course, one of the drawbacks of systematic sampling is that there might be a pass. It's possible that there will be systemic errors in your study because your system might be defective and would be able only to select certain groups and not everybody in your population of interest. So if you do that, then of course you will have problems with your sample. So the next that we have to consider is that sampling could also be used cluster sampling. And in a cluster sampling, we have what we call as arbitrary clustering, wherein you cluster your population into smaller groups, and the sampling will be done by cluster. For instance, General Santos City is a very large city with 26 barangays, and the 26 barangays have different puruks, and the different puruks is composed of different streets, different blocks. And it's very impossible for you to do a comprehensive sampling plan using random, systematic, or stratified sampling. Then you can do cluster sampling. And in the cluster sampling, you just divide the population into different clusters and then you draw samples from the cluster. So, for instance, if one particular street, one example would be a Block 32, Lot 1, Soledad, where I live, is selected as a cluster in your research, then everybody living in my block will be part of the respondents. That is cluster design. And that is usually done in large nationwide surveys with limited budgets. Of course, if you do cluster sampling, it is prone to design errors and it would require a lot of statistical computations in order to overcome the errors in the clustering. My advice is to avoid cluster sampling because it is very difficult to do. My favorite among all of these sampling designs is to use stratified sampling. It's easier done. You can simply set the classes, the categories, and from the classes and categories, you can start drawing your sample. That, in essence, are the different popular sampling designs that we can use when we do survey design. I hope may natutunan kayo sa akin ngayon. You learned something from me. Good day and God bless.